A storm of anger and defiance. Tens of thousands of people in Myanmar have been protesting against the military coup. So how big of a challenge are the protests to the military leaders? And how far will the generals go in their crackdown? This is Inside Story. Hi there, welcome to the programme. I'm Kim Vanel. Protesters in Myanmar have faced arrest, curfews and some internet blackouts for several days now. But despite those challenges, they have been going out in huge numbers to make their voices heard against this month's military coup. Tens of thousands protested on Saturday, demanding a return to civilian rule. They're also calling for the release of deposed leader Aung San Suu Kyi, who's under house arrest. Airline staff, health workers and school teachers are among groups who have joined the marches. And activists want a civil disobedience campaign to put pressure on the generals to give up power. They're angry about a number of detentions of government critics during overnight raids. Police have been increasingly cracking down on large gatherings, which they say violate COVID-19 restrictions. The UN has raised concern about the violence and use of live rounds against protesters. And its top rights body has adopted a resolution calling on Myanmar's military to reinstate the government and exercise restraint with demonstrators. The US has imposed sanctions on the generals and some businesses linked to them. But allies like Russia and China have dismissed the outcry against the coup as interference in Myanmar's internal affairs.
To the international community, I express my concern that any sanctions under consideration should be carefully targeted against specific individuals who are credibly alleged to have violated people's rights. Leaders of this coup are an appropriate focus of such actions.
Myanmar is undergoing the extremely complex challenges and delicate transition. We do not want to stall our nascent democratic transition in the country. We therefore look forward to receiving better understanding on the prevailing situation in the country and constructive engagement and cooperation from the international community. Myanmar will continue to engage with the United Nations towards lasting peace, stability and sustainable development to the benefit of the people in the country.
China is not in favour of holding this special session by the Human Rights Council. What happened in Myanmar is essentially Myanmar's internal affairs. What is required now is for the international community, on the basis of respecting Myanmar's sovereignty, political independence and territorial integrity and national unity, and help all the parties concerned in Myanmar engage in dialogue and reconciliation in accordance with the wishes and the interests of the Myanmar people.
We'll bring in our guests in just a moment, but first, Scott Heidler reports from Bangkok.
The anti-coup protests and the civil disobedience movement began very soon after that February 1st coup. And what's been interesting about how this has spread across the country and right across Myanmar is the groups that have involved themselves in this protest. You have different trade unions, the aviation workers, medical workers, teachers, and then student unions. They've been able to mobilize their people, their groups, to get out onto the streets and really ramp up those numbers very, very quickly. Now, obviously, social media has played a role in this, and internet connectivity has also, because in previous uprisings in Myanmar, those didn't exist yet. So obviously, the military maybe has been pushed to their back foot because of just how quickly and how well these groups have been able to organize themselves. And there's been major disruption because civil servants have also joined. So a lot of the government workings have really screeched to a halt. So the military, who is now running the country, is obviously having to grapple with that. Also, what's interesting about the protest movement, and this goes to Generation Z, who's really kind of leading a lot of these protests, is that they are being very creative and in the location and how they're protesting. And that is because they know that the international community needs to play a big role for them to get what they want, and that is for their leaders to be released and reinstalled. So what they have done is they've protested in front of the embassies in Yangon, the British Embassy, the US Embassy, the Japanese Embassy, and the Chinese Embassy, as well as the United Nations Office. So that's been a very pinpointed focus for them and a very sophisticated move by them, and that obviously is putting the military on their back foot as well politically. But what's interesting, within that context, you have China, and China has stayed with their longtime ally, Myanmar. They have a very tight relationship in previous uprisings and previous military dictatorships. So China has stayed next to its ally. So that is going to be something of a challenge when we move forward with the international community and how they react to the coup and what they can do against the Myanmar government. Scott Heidler for Inside Story.
It's time now to bring in our guests. In Yangon, we have Min Zaw-u, Executive Director of the Myanmar Institute for Peace and Security. In Bangkok, we have So Ong, a human rights activist who was involved in the 1988 People's Uprising in Myanmar. And in Kuala Lumpur, Bridget Welsh, an honorary research associate at the University of Nottingham's Asia Research Institute in Malaysia. A very warm welcome to you all. I'd like to begin with you, So Ong, if I may. How concerned are you about what we're seeing right now in Myanmar in terms of human rights violations?
From what I see, what is happening in the country, the people are very organized, and then they have been involved in the daily protests in everywhere in the country. But my concerns are that the security troops will use more excessive forces against the protesters. We have seen what has happened in Naypyidaw, that the unarmed peaceful protester was gunned down by the security forces. These things may happen more because we have a track record of the military and the security forces have used excessive force and then killed unarmed civilians in the past. We have seen that many, almost 1 million Rohingya people fled the country because of their offensive against the unarmed civilians.
Min Zaw-u, do you agree with that sentiment? How concerned are you about human rights violations happening right now? And how much of a challenge do you think these protests are to the military rulers?
Compared to what we experienced in 1988, the response from the government and also the resistance from the general public became more sophisticated. So in 1988, when the military started cracking down the protests in all over the country, they opened fire. They used live bullets. And this time, military was very restrained. So we saw some use of force in some isolated cases, such as like in Naypyidaw, the one protester was shot. But in other area, except from that incident, no live bullets were used. And we also saw like only about 3 to 4 cases where police used water cannon. In Yangon, it has been about 4 days. The authorities removed police presence from the streets. So that was a quite sophisticated response we did not anticipate. So we all thought the military would deploy the army troops and use at least rubber bullets, not to let people come into the street, but it did not happen yet.
I'd like to put this to you, Bridget Welsh. How much of a challenge do you think these protests are to the military? Are they just going to continue to be heavy-handed? Are they going to increase the severity of their tactics? How do you see this playing out?
Well, I think that we can see that the protests have been tremendous in terms of their spread across the country and the scope of participation. And I think these are going to be very difficult for the military to control. One of the reasons why they have not used force, as has been discussed just now, is because the sheer scope of resistance that has happened from the Myanmar people. And I think that right now the protesters are focusing their attention on the international community in terms of asking for assistance, hoping that there can be some sort of political resolution to this crisis. But I think we're also seeing the nature of opposition transform in Myanmar. The level of sophistication is also among the protesters in terms of how they're passing their messages, how they're connecting, the type of tactics that they're using. So I think this is going to be something for the long haul.
Just to follow up on that, I just want to pick up on something you said. You talked about, focusing their efforts on getting the attention of the international community. Do you think there is a path for international diplomacy to bring about perhaps earlier elections or for reinstating Aung San Suu Kyi's party to power? I mean, are there any divisions within the military which might be a sort of cracking point?
I think there are clearly role that the international community can play to promote dialogue within Myanmar, also to engage with the military in terms of suggesting and telling them that the situation is very different than the past. The military is still living very much in an arena of the past, and they don't recognize that the international community is very different now. And I think that there are steps that can be taken on multiple levels, but the international response can't just be at the political level. It also has to be broader in terms of engagement with the protesters, engagement with the struggles within Myanmar itself. I think if it's just at the top, it's not going to be effective.
So, Aung, we heard there a little mention about, previous clashes, previous uprisings where people were very angry with military rule. I know you were involved in 1988. There were more street clashes in 2007 when people stood up to military rule. How are things different now?
Oh, it's very much different from what we have experienced in 1988 and what is happening now in our country. Because now the people, the protesters are more tech savvy, and then they are very innovative with the way they protest. There is a Make-Tea alliance that people, the protesters in Hong Kong, in Thailand, they have a connection due to the openness that they have enjoyed in the country for the past 10 years. So they have engaged in the regional forums and all that. So they managed to gather and then utilize these tactics, so that we have seen that many innovative ideas in the protesters, especially in the cities. But we have to also note that the rounding up of the protesters, especially the leaders and the youth, is happening in the remote areas or the smaller regions in the states, happening every night. Even in Yangon, these things are happening. So that's why the people in the cities are very much aware about this, and then they even defied the curfew, that 8 p.m., 4 a.m. curfew, and came out to protect the protesters at night time. We have seen this evidence in the videos which happened last night in Yangon. But in the small states like Shan State, where I come from, it's not as big as the Yangon or Mandalay, those cities. So that we are very much concerned about these demonstrators, protesters who are involved in these protests, and then they be rounded up.
When we talk about, the use of technology and internet and protest movements, when it happens all around the world, I mean, we have generations of people now in their 20s and 30s who have never known a world really without the use of the internet. But obviously we have seen the military generals take aim at that. Some internet blackouts and now a proposed new cybersecurity law. Minzo, can you explain this new cybersecurity law to us, what it means and how it's likely to be used?
Yes, this law was initially prepared by the previous government, the NLD-led government, but I was told that the new authorities treat some of the measures that will make it difficult for the ISP, and also allow the government to crack down those people using internet technology to support anti-government protests. But however, the young people are still quite resilient, that they can pretty much avoid the government attempt to block the internet, especially the social media. The government actually tried to initially block the internet, and they realized that they also rely on the internet on their command and control. For that reason, they reopened it. But they try to block the social media, but the young people are very good at facilitating and navigating it. And actually, even they use very sophisticated applications, such as they can monitor protests all around the country on the Google Map. It's like a near time and almost like a live presentation, and they even know which group is leading to which direction and what colors of clothes they are wearing and so on. And also they have organized a logistical team. And so I think that kind of cat and mouse, the technological, the restrictions, and also attempt to evade those restrictions will continue for coming months. This is what we can assess.
Bridget Welsh, I see that the military is planning on releasing some 23,000 prisoners. Why is it doing that? Is that an attempt to garner some goodwill, or is this a clearing of the prisons?
Well, I think the concern is that it is a clearing of the prisons to put other people in. And then, as has been discussed, the night raids that are happening are very worrying, and they're happening all across the country as they pick up people, not only people who are part of the protests, but also election officials that were connected to the November 8th election. So I think there is this sense of kind of worrying cloud over Myanmar because of this particular decision. But at the same time, you can also see that the military is trying to win allies, both internationally and at home. You can see that it's using divide and rule tactics with the ethnic minorities, reaching out with having alliances with certain parties. It's also trying to offer different positions to different people through patronage, and of course also to win support among some of the people they think will come to it, even some of these prisoners that they've left out. So I think that this is part of their tactics that they're adopting.
I want to ask how we think that the detentions, the arrests, the human rights violations might impact the momentum, if at all, of the protests. Soy Aung, what do you think?
I think that the momentum of the protest will not die down, even these arrests and then intimidation by the authorities. But I would also like to stress that the fact that this cyber security law, which they are going to impose very, very soon, is the biggest threat that people will not be able to use the internet securely, because people share information each other mostly on internet, and also monitor human rights violations, peace process on the ground, and to study a new technology or economy, etc. But these things will go away when this government started using this law, and then we've heard that they have got the assistance from China that is installing this firewall so that they could monitor, and then they are asking, sending out the orders or instructions to the mobile operators to follow these instructions. So this is very important, and people will not be able to practice their freedom of expression, and then moreover, they will be very risky when they share their information, and then the government is monitoring them all the time.
Min Zaw Oo, before we get on to what the UN is doing or not doing, can you just explain to our viewers who are the allies, or at least who is supporting or wants to support the military in Myanmar?
Well, China and Russia usually stick to whoever in the government they side with it. So either the military or the civilian government. So they claim it's as internal affairs. The military even try to reach out the current Thai generals, and also try to seek some help from the potential allies. But at this point, I don't think the military have many allies in the international community. So people are still watching whether military can hold on to the power. So at this point, the military, for the reason they know that this is the case, so they are focusing more on the consolidating their power. This is one of the reasons they don't even care to crack down those protests, and now it's become more like a festivals in many major cities.
Well, you talk about consolidating power. What other signs are there within Myanmar beyond what we're seeing on the streets that the generals are in this for the long haul? I'm talking, the stacking of the courts or political appointments of people in positions of power. Are we seeing signs like that? That was to you, Min Zaw Oo,
we do see
please.
that, for example, like in Naypyidaw, even though there are a lot of internet sensation about the civil disobedience movement, and some of the ministries are functioning, and some of the ministry are even approving projects. We heard like a lot of businessmen are now flocking into Naypyidaw and trying to get their projects approved by the new authorities. And so that's a sign that like the authorities are also become super liberal, like trying to reward the business communities, so they're like to prove that they could do a better job. So this is a sign like how the military is trying to consolidate its power, because the Naypyidaw is pretty much isolated from the rest of the countries, and they can control pretty much most of the ministries over there.
Bridget Welsh, coming to the United Nations, at a UN session on Myanmar, the UN Deputy Rights Chief said the world is watching Myanmar. Is the world watching, and does it care?
I think the world is watching. I think that the protests have taken the international imagination. I think people have seen the bravery of people come out to the streets. And I think that there is a tension on this country. And in part because of the history that it's had in terms of the long decades against military rule. And of course, the transition that began in 2010 and was the election in 2015 captured the international imagination. And of course, there was the horrific events of 2017 of the genocide against the Rohingya, which has also brought attention to Myanmar.
I mean more from a perspective of, will
carefully.
the international community actually act? The UN has put out a statement, but it's got China and Russia there. The US has said it's going to put out targeted sanctions on specific military generals and their families. But it doesn't want to negatively impact the people of Myanmar, does it, with wide-ranging sanctions? So what will or can the international community actually do?
Well, I think there is discussion happening in the international community of what the different options are. The United States has begun with targeted sanctions. They've been very modest in scope, but I think they're also talking to their allies in order to actually get more cooperation. And so I think this conversation is extending. I think in the context of ASEAN countries, the dialogue with the government has started. And there's hoping to have an ASEAN meeting to discuss with the military, the coup government, what's happening and try to put pressure. In particular, ASEAN countries are concerned about a potential refugee crisis that may emerge from the situation inside Myanmar. So I think there are, in a sense, a series of dialogues that have begun and a series of actions. But you're right, there are very limited tools at the international community's disposal. I think crucial in this conversation is what China does. And while I think it is clear that at the UN that China has stood by Myanmar and on the concerns for human rights, they've also helped to tighten the circumstances against the people in Myanmar with working with this coup government. But you also see a situation where there are many Chinas. And I think that China also is in a situation now where the international community is watching it very carefully. It's not the same as it was before.
Yeah.
And so I think we're going to see more interventions and more pressure on China.
We are coming to the end of the program. I'd like to finish with you, So Aung, if I may. What are your hopes for how this all plays out?
Well, I hope that the movement in the country with the diaspora of the people, diverse ethnic communities, LGBT, student workers, academia, can be combined with the critical and very, very precise international supports. When we talk about the international role, that the international community can help with the targeted sanctions that US is talking about, and other countries, such as the New Zealand Prime Minister Ardern showed the true principle of what a real world leader is. They suspend the relationship with the military regime.
Okay.
I don't see many countries have showed that kind of a decisive, even saying that they don't recognize this military coup in the country.
So stronger action from world leaders. We will have to leave it there for time. I really appreciate all of you for coming on the programme. Thank you to our guests, Min Zaw Oo, So Aung and Bridget Welsh. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. So it's facebook.com/ AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Kim Vanel, and the entire team here in Doha. Bye-bye for now.